I'm Jonathan Welch. I work in air cargo movement policy, and what we're going to be talking today is about the capabilities-based cargo movement. And we're starting with the idea of cargo movement with the intent to expand onto how we're going to do passenger movement, how we're going to do air mobility squadron manning or aerial port manning. This whole conversation kind of started with how do we compare two dissimilar organizations in the aerial port enterprise? How do we quantify work being done by a Charleston or a McChord or a Travis Air Force Base, where Travis might have a channel mission and McChord might have a different mission to support the Corps located there at Lewis. So it kind of started with how do we compare workloads, and has expanded into the idea of how do we quantify talent, basically. And in order to look at everything, what we started with is the idea of aerial ports and air mobility squadrons, and how they're positioned. And what their positioning is basically based off of is during an O-plan activation, some amount of airflow is going to be assigned to move through their locations in order to reach an ultimate destination. And that airflow is in the initial 30-day plan. These documents are already codified and on the shelf. And that's what the primary mission of an air mobility squadron is to support some major surge operations. So while a lot of other units are manned, like your security forces, like your maintenance units at a wing, to deploy with whatever that wing's mission is, these guys are actually the opposite of that. Their mission is during a mass exodus. Their mission is to stay and ensure that throughput is available. And so they have kind of a fire department in case the bell goes up type of mission. And that's where we have to figure out how to do training and maintain proficiency in that type of environment. When are we expecting World War III to kick off every day of the year? No, but they need to be positioned in order to accomplish that. And so the 30-day airflow outlines nearly to the hour how much lift is going to be coming into a location and how much work is going to be conducted by that unit. And that quantity is called the missions on ground, or the MOG. The idea of the MOG is important throughout the rest of the briefing because it allows us to quantify how many aircraft we're going to be laying our hands on at any given point in time during an operation. And then from there, we're going to kind of step backwards in order to determine how a port needs to be manned, how a port needs to be funded in order to produce that capability. What is the capability? In the past, the idea of a MOG is measured in aircraft. One of the things we've talked about is some sort of port hours or some sort of talent hour that we've measured. But historically, what the air transportation enterprise has used is the idea of tons. The concern with that, at least from the cargo policy team, is that not all tons are created equal. If I have 50 tons of single pallets, your general cargo, it might be household goods or something, that's much easier to load than 50 tons of explosives. 50 tons of explosives have a lot more effort put into it, a lot more manpower at the port are invested in 50 tons of explosives. Or even 50 tons of vehicles, because of the amount of work that goes into chaining down and securing vehicles on an airplane. So a ton isn't a ton in regards to the air transportation enterprise. So that's one of the things that we wanted to look at over the course of this is how does maybe a ton of cargo or a ton of explosives or a ton of vehicles equate to talent or effort or some port hour being put into that, is where we started moving into a capability. How do we capture this? We call it cargo capability. The cargo capability idea comes from kind of two different feeding thoughts. The first on the left being the MOG that we talked about before, where these hardware assets at a port like MHE or material handling equipment is that you'll have so many loaders positioned at your port, or so many forklifts positioned at your port to be able to load aircraft. And you go down into storage, for example. MMHSs are basically, if you think of an office supply shelf, a rack system that is built into a warehouse that allows us to handle pallets in that way. versus a grid yard, which is more like a parking lot where your pallets are laid all the way out to from here to the base theater, and you have to go find them and fetch them, whereas an MMHS might bring them to you. So depending on what a port has, it increases or decreases their capability to handle an amount of cargo. And so when we're looking at something like this, if you see the blue line between MMHS and grid, and I know blue and oranges are particular colors. In our line of work, there are a lot of red-green colorblind people, so I can't use red and green. So just imagine green is go for advantage and red, orange is red for disadvantage. But a blue advantage check for MMHS's grid is if I have an MMHS and a robot will go pull pallets for me, I'm going to take that score over the backup grid yard score, because that's primarily what we're going to use, and that's primarily going to give us the better number. So that's what we call an advantage check. Or if we're looking at a finger dock or a high line is an aluminum rack that we line up all of our cargo on in order to push on the loader, whereas a finger dock are fingers that stick out at the back of the warehouse, and all of them are automated. You can basically drive up and a guy comes out there and pushes a button and the dock loads your cargo for you. So a finger dock would again be the advantage check that we would do. Whereas if we're looking at something the next level higher, if no matter how cool our docks are or how cool our storage solution is, if we're limited on actual loaders to get cargo to the airplane, the red is going to be a disadvantage check. So whatever your lowest score is what's going to end up bubbling up to the next level. And those are the types of ideas that we wanted to handle, is where some aspects of how a port are built can gain you benefits, but ultimately we're going to have to look at some limiting factors in regards to what our capability is, and that's frankly right now how we calculate MOG. But across the air transportation enterprise, it's calculated differently. So at an air mobility squadron, MOG is calculated differently than an aerial port squadron does. And that is part of this effort, is how we want to measure or at least calculate the capability. And the manpower side of it is on the other. You know, we could have all the loaders and all the equipment we could want, but if we don't have the load teams to be able to handle that, or the teams to be able to build up cargo, we're going to be limited in regards to what our talent can do. So we call it talent, not manpower, because the idea is someone who's been doing this for 30 years or someone who has a 7 skill level or a 9 skill level is going to have a higher talent level than just saying a 3 level body or a man hour available, where we know someone who's been doing this a while can accomplish probably 5 or maybe 7 or more hours of equivalent work compared to the new guy who's stumbling through it, who's checking his books, who's going through this step by step. And so those are the things that we want to measure, is skill level proficiency, certain certifications, certain SEIs, and all of this is going to be pulled out of the system, as opposed to having someone go through and manually try and figure this stuff out. That we would be able to produce this by looking into what's in our training records, what's in our manpower assignment, in order to make and calculate this number. Questions on this slide?
Are the finger docks at all tied to the MMHS?
Yes.
I mean, is it, so like if you have an MMHS, you typically have a finger dock?
Correct, actually. So that's one of the beauties of the system, is when we say, hey, this aircraft is coming in, you're at a place like Dover, you punch in, this aircraft is coming in, it's going to this location, and it picks out the cargo, and it'll even arrange it in order that it's going to go onto the plane when it picks it off the shelf and arranges it on the dock for you. So all you have to do is pull up, and it's already what we call sequenced, and put on the loader, and all you have to do is drive it to the plane.
The other question too would be, what % of our ports have that compared to grid and highline?
Mainly the large strategic locations. So aerial port squadrons like your Dover and your Ramstein would have this type of technology, whereas something like your Aviano or your Mildenhall, kind of on the fringes, your support organizations in the system, would not. And that's why we wanted to include all these things in the hierarchy, so that if you don't have it, then your score would default to the other score, and the system, or at least this calculation, gonculator, eventually would absorb that automatically. The best part is you could assign kind of a scalable score to how old or new that system is or how capable it is. Again, focusing on capability, the intent is that our older systems would have a lower score, or if they're not connected, it would have a lower score than a fully networked aerial port. And that's why we wanted to look at, again, the capability is all these factors would bubble up into some MOG or some talent hour that we would be able to produce out of our location. And so this is what all of this would bubble into. And taking a minute to talk about this, we don't exactly know, and that's why we wanted to bring the people in this room into this conversation early, is that we don't know what a talent hour equates to when we talk about a ton of cargo. So these things are going to be kind of adapted over time in order to plug into each other at a certain point. So if you look at the manpower of a unit, all the skill levels combined and all of the available talent combined, there's going to be a sweet spot that we call the +0 green in the amount of work that they have, where you have enough work to keep you busy from 7 a.m. in the morning till 4:30 p.m. in the afternoon, and everybody has enough work to go through their upgrade tasks, to keep training proficient and move through everything. And that's the sweet spot. But a little bit less work is okay. People will hit the gym more, people will study more, their CDCs. However, when we get to not enough work, we're going to cross a threshold into what we call -2. We won't be able to maintain training and proficiency. We won't be able to maintain these things, and we'll have empty warehouses or unutilized personnel. And same thing on the upside. Maybe a little extra work is A-okay. That's how you win annual awards. That's how you have good packages, good EPRs, people who excel in training and thrive in that busy environment. And some ports will function at a +1. However, during a surge, we expect that we're going to go to a +2 type of environment. We're going to be maxing people out. We're going to be putting people on 12s. And that's okay because it's built in the system, but it's not something we're intending to do for 60 or 90 days or longer. And so as a manpower tool, or not a manpower tool, but a capacity tool that I can bring to someone like Colonel Earlywine or General Hawkins and say, hey boss, we're not looking to micromanage this system, but we've noticed you've been running Ramstein a little hot for the last 3 months. Maybe we can divert some of that cargo to Spangdahlem, Mildenhall, Aviano in order to alleviate that, get them back down into the green, and maybe push a +1 to some of these other locations, because that's what the network is for. And we say that anecdotally, but this is something that we recently noticed with Dover and McGuire, that since the end of Iraq War, so much cargo had been flowing through Dover that it just kind of trickled off. But McGuire was still running the same as they were back in 2008 and 2009. So while there was no change to the network and no change to the way that we managed the network, because cargo just kind of dried up, we noticed that Dover, being the biggest port in CONUS, had less work than McGuire, which was the smallest port in CONUS. And so these types of indicators, we threw up the flag and said, hey, I think we should just shift it a little up the road an hour and a half and push that work to Dover. And that was one of the changes that we made at the beginning of this year, based on the kind of sweet spot model of how we calculate workload and capacity at these locations.
Just so, didn't Dover just recently go through construction on their ramp and flatline?
Yes.
Was that the cause of the flow?
Nope. It was all because of the end of the Iraq War. It started in 2011 and kind of tapered down. So we actually have a briefing about this. I'll kick it to you just so you can see the math and the history of it. When we plotted out in kind of a meta-analysis, it revealed a lot to us from kind of over the course of the last 10 years. But it was one of those things that if you're working it and you're working boxes, you have a busy month and a not busy month, they may not have noticed the die-off. But when we took a step back, there was a huge reduction in the amount of cargo that flowed through Dover since the end of the Iraq War. But I'll kick that to you after this.
Is that why they're moving the working docks too?
Yes. So the movement of the working dogs is part of that. Hey, we're taking some of that workload. We're giving McGuire a break for a little while. You can catch up on training. You can catch up on cleaning up the place, and pushing that to Dover, which has more capability. So working dogs, blood, all of that stuff, anything going to CENTCOM has now been moved to Dover. So, and that was as a result of looking at this in a capabilities standpoint. And so this is what it would look like. Again, these are notional units. I don't know what 4,000 hours, talents per month equals, but we know that there's going to be a surge level and a steady state level that we need to meet. And so when we build this, we could say, okay, a small unit, 50 people or 75 people, which is something that looks like our Aviano, for example, would have kind of thin slices, thin stripes. And so if we look at this, their average day is right on track, where we need them to be. But their surge day is so far above what we call the red line that they would not be able to get to that based on how they're currently positioned. Okay? So what we would do is grow that unit, which would make the stripes wider, but also increase the baseline level to say that, you know what, on an average day, they might be operating in the yellow, so we would rely on maybe Marine Corps mobilizations or exercises to augment some of that training for them. However, during a surge capability, like we see in the mid-2000s or like we saw in 2009, they would be ready to push into the red for a limited amount of time, and it's appropriately scaled in order to meet that. So this is, and again, this is all going to be tweakable. These numbers are kind of notional right now, but this is the basis behind the idea of basing everything on some sort of capability.
And Jonathan, you could make this shift by a variety of different ways, right? You could
Correct.
manpower, modernization, leverage some of that technology you talked about.
Right.
So there's multiple ways to get from. So it's not just strictly a manpower plus up that you're talking about.
Correct. And it's ultimately how we satisfy that capability.
Understanding that relationship and how that changing that dynamic impacts your capacity and capability to support the workload element that's coming at the workload requirement.
Correct. So,
And
yes,
this
ma'am.
is gonna be unique to each base?
Yes. And I would say that because the O-plan surge is unique to each base. For every O-plan ID, there's a different airflow pattern that moves through different bases in Europe, different bases in the Pacific, and that all is going to be included to this. It's not meant to be a day-to-day management tool, though. It's meant to be a studied annual, once every 2 to 3 years, look at this, make sure that things are aligned the way that they need to be, and then move this. Similar to the way that we just did the channel, we looked at it after a couple of years and said, not quite where we need it to be, and rearranged some work between Dover and McGuire. And we recently completed something between Travis and McCord as well, where we moved work from one location to another. But to answer your question, yes, it would be unique.
And I think this, if you keep there, sir, I think this is a great illustration of what I've been trying to convey, which is if we go based off just the current workload to figure out what our manpower is, and that average day continues to drop, and you drop the manpower with it, then you get further and further away from that capability to support the surge that you're there purposely to do. And I don't think that the powers that be, AMC, whoever decided that MOG, that capability I want to support the old plan, is diminishing through a manpower study, and that's why we hit the brakes in order to do that. So I just think this is of all the slides, this one clearly shows you how if you continue to drop with that, we're getting further and further away from what we're truly there to support. So.
Yes. And to your concerns, Chief, as well as one of the comments that you made earlier, I'll actually pull up directly after this briefing of what the work has looked like over the course of the past 10 years for Dover and McGuire, and you will see the highs and lows that they've experienced just since 2007. So what all the end of this is that it would get us to a MOG. It would get us to a normal operating range, an optimal operating range, as well as a surge operating range. And all of these things would feed into manpower, budgeting, facility requirements, would feed into supporting a war plan as well as a day-to-day requirements. And that's really the intention and why we're asking for everybody's interest in this is we want to build this right and scaled appropriately so that we can use it as a management tool long-term for our ports, as well as have the conversation with you guys in regards to manning that side of it as well. And that concludes my briefing, minus some backup slides. So if you went through the pre-prepared slideshow, some of those slides got kicked to backups, and we can talk about the management tool side of things. But as for what needed to be delivered, that was it.